Be sure to subscribe and like our channel.
Welcome. This is Queen City Videocast and Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. Depending if you like us on visuals or if you like us on audio, you get both options. Unfortunately, Andrieh won't be able to join us today. He will be joining us back next week. He has to attend some obligations tonight. However, what we got coming up at the studio, 607 Gerrard Street East, Toronto, Ontario, 4th floor, 401, 402, is that tomorrow Andrieh is going to be running a Zachiel ritual for prosperity and expansion with the Jupiterian energies. So we're going to be doing an archangel summoning tomorrow, and then the week after that we have the workshop of how to communicate with a goddess. Doesn't matter which one you want. It's your pick how you want to do it, but we'll teach you those basics in that workshop. And then the big finale that everyone's been waiting for, we're getting into the 3-year Goetia plan and Semaphoreš plan. So that is starting probably in the next 2 weeks. We got our slates in. We got our workshop materials going. So that's coming up very soon for our sponsors. If you haven't checked out our sponsor link, you will see that below in the description. So that's for 3 years of demonology, archangels, names of God, depending how you want to play it. Doesn't really matter. And we'll still have our normal workshops for the basics, such as pendulums, divinations, etc. So just be on watch for that. So tonight we have Nicholas Pearson. He's been immersed in all aspects of the mineral kingdom for nearly 30 years. As one of the leading voices in crystal healing today, he offers a unique blend of science and spirituality alongside a grounded, practical approach to working with crystals. Several books, including the Crystal Basics, and he lives in Orlando, Florida. Welcome to the show, Nicholas.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, so we have the book here for people who want to check out our library. If you check this out too long, we're going to say bye from Nicholas, but this is the book we're going to be discussing today, The Energetic Healing and Spiritual Power of 450 Gemstones, Crystal Basics. So this is an augment to a previous book, isn't it?
Yeah, think of them as siblings. It's not a complete repackaging of the same thing, but the big one, Crystal Basics, came out in 2020. So this is its younger sibling, which covers 450 stones instead of 200. It's got a slightly different slant or angle on those 450. And then it's got 5 brand new chapters introducing how to work with crystals leading up to that directory.
Right. So what got you wanting to write another crystal book? I mean, we know you love minerals. However, it's books are projects, right? So
there are a few things that kind of came together to bring out the Pocket Encyclopedia. First and foremost was how great the reception was to Crystal Basics when it came out in 2020. The world was in a pretty strange place, but people still liked the book. And I got 2 great pieces of feedback that were kind of contradictory. One was, I wish there were more than 200 crystals. And the other was, it's so darn big, it's hard to carry around. And I thought, I bet I can tackle both of those together. There are a bunch of little pocket encyclopedias out there on crystals. Some are great, some are less great than others. But why not do it my own way? Why not kind of put together the rocks and minerals that I think are prevalent in this time, practice. So together before I sent it off to my publisher, and here it is out in the world finally.
Right. So what was the selection? I mean, 450 crystals and gemstones is not a small feat. I mean, it is not a small feat. So how did you start selecting them, and how, there's thousands of them. So how was making the cut and choices for these? What was your thinking behind it?
I mean, first and foremost, I took a hard look at the 200 that are in Crystal Basics. Some of those did not get recycled. because I wanted to have enough space to look at new things, and also because some just didn't seem to be more than a passing phase in the market as a whole, and I wanted to kind of keep things fresh and new and exciting. I needed to make sure that the kind of fundamentals, our amethyst and agate and calcite and quartz and hematite, those sorts of things are all in there, as well as most of the precious gems that we could all name off the top of our heads, like ruby and sapphire and emerald and diamond and things like that. But for the rest of it, it was imperative that I include two seemingly contradictory classes of things: the really humble, common, kind of lowly rocks, if you will. They're some of my favorite things to work with, like granite and slate and limestone and marble. And they're often overlooked because of how ubiquitous they are. And the other part of it is I wanted some really rare and unusual things that you might not know much about or might have trouble finding in your average crystal book. And part of the reason for going at both ends of that spectrum was to ensure that it was a very holistic guide. I wanted to have info for the people who are fine mineral collectors and get the weird and unusual things, but I also wanted to remind people there's magic underneath your feet. No matter where you are, there's rock beneath you or around you. It might have been moved by humankind, it might have been brought there by natural circumstances, but it doesn't take much to go out to the world and find rock and stone. And as an effort to kind of decapitalize, deconsumerize crystal healing practice, I wanted to remind us that we don't always have to buy things. We can. I love supporting local and indie bookstores and metaphysical shops, but there's just as much magic as the rocks you find in the landscape.
Right. So, I mean, it's really talking about the basics of what you can actually get right now. And then you have the pocketbook where you just pull it out and be like, hey, this is actually what I found. So it actually becomes more like a fun adventure that we can say, actually. So this is where, in that, how did you come up with energetic correspondences? I mean, you break it down into things such as physical healing, psychological healing, and spiritual healing, right? So was this through researching various different books as source material? Was this through your own experiences? What got you to kind of break it up into those categories and get those traits?
Yeah, a little column A, a little column B. You know, I always start with primary firsthand experience, whether that's something I've lived myself. Some of that is empirical, some of that we can measure and track in real time, and some of it falls under the umbrella of personal gnosis. It's not always verifiable, but then we start to look at a wider data set. So I look to the experiences of friends, colleagues, students, clients from real life practice with crystals and one-on-one sessions and group settings and classes and the like. And then I also include literature review.
Right. So can you give a few examples of gemstones on that you've been working with that actually, went through in the descriptions when you're writing it about for like the actual uses?
I'm sorry, it cut out there for a moment.
Could you talk about your experience with a few of the gemstones that actually made it directly into the book when we're talking about those descriptions you wrote about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably the clearest examples that come from personal experience are things that you can't find in other books. So I had to sit down and do it myself. So one of those was Rainbow Lattice Sunstone, which is fairly new on the market. And I haven't found it in another encyclopedia yet. So hopefully this might be the first place. So the first thing that I do is just kind of sit and feel it out energetically, to experience how I feel holding that stone, working with that stone, meditating with that stone, recognizing that what I'm experiencing is at least 50% my own energy. The crystal might be redirecting that focus, might be revealing it, but it's there. It's not something the crystal's bringing to me. So we got to sit with those over and over again. And once I kind of paint a picture of what that feels like energetically, I start to decode the geology. I look at how it was formed, what its ingredients are, what its crystal system might be like. And in this particular case, we have a variety of feldspar called orthoclase that is an aluminosilicate mineral. And then it's got this beautiful geometric, almost iridescent lattice-shaped inclusion that is a variety of iron minerals. I've seen some debates. Some assert that it is definitely hematite. Others say it might be ilmenite. We're going to say it's an iron oxide. And when we look at the kind of confluence of those things, when we look at the shapes they form, we get this picture of something that brings light to really rarefied parts of the self, the superconscious, the blueprint, if you will, helping us integrate change and transformation at that highest level. And once I kind of take those personal experiences and the decoding of it geologically, then I take it to other people. I see what other people have as far as their experiences go. So that's effectively what I did time and time again for things that I couldn't find in other books, as well as what I do generally in my practice. I always kind of start with that personal experience, then the geology, and then maybe I'll look it up in some other books.
Right. So this is where there's probably a lot of Google spreadsheets or journals then on this for your personal experience.
Yeah, I have written things down on any scrap of paper I can over the years. In 2004, I started working for an earth science museum, and while I was in the building, of course, it was all science. But on my lunch break or on downtime, or eventually it got to be where they would let me borrow minerals as long as they came back in the same condition, of course. So what I did on my personal time didn't have to be science driven. So that's when I started kind of noticing these trends and things like composition and structure and the geologic processes involved. They impact the crystal's energy. So I've got notes that go back 20 years on this kind of thing.
Right. So if you had to pick a stone, I know there's so many different stones and crystals you could choose from. Or crystal had a deep impact on you, and what was that experience?
The example I use most often for this is rhodonite. So rhodonite is a manganese silicate, and it is often touted as a stone related to, we'll say, emotional balance, emotional well-being. And people kind of come into that from different perspectives. I've actually got my favorite kind of gemmy red piece of rhodonite here. It's often kind of pink. Depending on what other trace minerals are in there, it can vary its color and appearance quite a lot. But this is a stone that has had really profound effects on my emotional well-being. When I was in college, I was diagnosed with an anxiety and panic disorder. It was debilitating, is putting it nicely. I really couldn't function as a human being, let alone a grown-up in a world that was becoming increasingly more complicated as I came of age. And rhodonite is one of those things that I came to as an adjunct to other therapies. I certainly took all of the normal routes of seeing the right kinds of professionals to support my well-being. And as things didn't work and we crossed them off the list, I had to kind of widen my scope. But rhodonite is something I came to that brings me this sense of internal calm. It's like a emotional ballast. It doesn't make the sense of worry, anxiety, fear, disruption go away, but it makes it less pervasive. It makes it feel like I can keep an even keel no matter what the emotional waters are all around me. And in that sense, it helps me be present without, we'll say, taking on that stuff or letting it take me over. So I work with this on an ongoing basis, even though I pretty much have that managed on the typical day. It's still nice to have additional energetic support, and it's just a really generous rock. It's one that just keeps showing up for me in new and exciting ways sometimes.
Right. I mean, rhodonite, I absolutely love myself personally. It's one of my favorite stones, and between the two of them, I'm like, oh, you guys are awesome, right? So you're talking about work particularly. So how does that look like? If someone's new to rocks and just crystal work in general, what does work look like in a practical manner? Could you walk us the listeners through it step by step?
Absolutely. So in simplest terms, when we work with crystals, we are entering into a collaborative relationship with them. I don't think of crystals as inert tools that I exercise my will over to obtain an outcome. I think of it as cooperation, as partnership. So at heart, I describe myself as a kind of feral animist. No matter what else is happening, I'm appealing to the spirit of things. I'm coordinating my efforts with the consciousness inside crystals. That's the internal level of the work that's taking place. But when it comes to the external level, it could be as simple as tucking a crystal into your pocket to bring its energy into your field throughout the day. It could be wearing it as jewelry, as I'm doing now. It could be placing it on your desk or somewhere else in your environment. Those are kind of like, we'll say, beginner level steps that we can take. And often the subtle and simple are the things that give us long lasting results. Other ways that we can work with crystals involve using them as materia magica, incorporating them into spellcraft, adding them to candle spells, using crystal grids as part of invocations or other kind of ritual work. We can make crystal elixirs that we use as a kind of magic potion to anoint things. We can add them to spell jars and spell pouches. In a therapeutic context, we can build grids or layouts by creating a kind of geometric design of crystals on or around the body or in our environment to achieve a particular therapeutic result. But at the end of the day, no matter what the external form looks like, no matter what flavor or style of work we engage in, if we neglect the spirit of that stone, we're only tapping into a fraction of its potential.
Right. So that opens up a whole discussion on things. So you're talking about the spirit of the stone versus the energetics of the stone. Do you differentiate between the two of them, or do you kind of view them as one and the same thing?
So one is the driver of the other. We can't have one without the other. And, I suppose it depends on what our animism looks like as to what the origins are. But, the material body of it and the spiritual essence within it are intertwined. They are, we'll say, reflections of different organizations or different layers of its total existence. But energy as spirit and the body, the structure that houses them.
Right. So we got cut off a little bit there. There was a little bit of lag time and or gap. So I'm not sure if we got everything, but just to kind of recap, you're saying there is no separation between the two. One that was kind of housing it, and then the spirit kind of animates it per se. Did I hear that correctly?
More or less. The energy of a crystal is the result of its material form and its spiritual form working together.
Okay, great. So you talked about crystal grids in particular, and I know that's always a hot topic. Like that's almost what the main thing when people think of magical uses of crystals. That's the first thing that flashes in people's mind. So the way you go about in the book, I mean, it seems like you kind of give like a little bit of introduction to everything and say, hey, experiment with it. And then if you want to go further with it, you totally can. But with crystal grids, do you have any particular ones you like working with? Any particular shapes?
I kind of use them all in my practice. I think there are so many ways to go about creating a grid. We can have a particular shape in mind and try to use that as a template. We can also think analytically about how number and form have their own layers of meaning and build them into the grid as kind of telling a story, if you will. We can use symbols, a heart, a lemniscate, a circle, a spiral, and use that as the kind of basis for how we want to build the grid. But I think ultimately, whatever shape the crystal grid is in, it needs to have a meaning that reflects the outcome you desire. So I use a lot of different shapes in my practice. And it just depends on like what the purpose of that grid is, how we're collaborating together and what we want to achieve. And a lot of times I build grids kind of freeform. I start with, this is our goal. These are the crystals that support that goal. And then I listen to the stones and let them guide me as to where they need to be.
Right. And when you say listen, I think viewers, if they're beginning on this, is it audio listening? Is it body listening? What would that be for you?
There's no right or wrong way to perceive crystal energy. I find myself more, we'll say, clairsentient than anything else. So it's an inner knowing. It's not so much, the crystal's painting a picture in my head of what that grid looks like. It's not necessarily speaking to me in words, although, I've met some rocks that talk pretty loud. But it's that inner energetic relationship that manifests for me in a kind of sensitivity to the overall energy. If I place it in an effective space, I feel that. If I place it in an ineffective place, I feel that too. But it starts with letting the crystal guide me. So, if you're kind of at the beginning of your practice and you're not sure what that's going to look or feel like, I would say just experiment. Trial and error is the best thing that you can rely upon to find that inner sense of authority, to learn to trust your instincts. And if you get it right, great. If you get it wrong, great. Keep doing it. There's no substitute for experience. And what we read in books is a guideline. Crystal grids are kind of like recipes. We can follow them to the T. We can also substitute. It's helpful to know why we're substituting and what that effect is going to be. If you're trying to make roasted potatoes and you don't have black pepper, you could substitute cinnamon. That's probably not substitutions based on what we have available or what we like, but
Right. Again, unfortunately, internet a little bit laggy on things, so we lost the last part there from you, even though I could see your mouth moving on the video.
Yeah, so essentially I was just saying that when we work with crystals, when we make grids, if we want to turn to books and find these instructions, treat them like recipes. We can make substitutions, but they should be substitutions that match the purpose behind it.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, because when people start talking about crystals, they're like, this is the exact formula. In my experience, it has not been the exact formulas whatsoever. It's been very much like, all right, is this going to work for what you need right now? And it goes back to even what you're talking about earlier, is like, what's your relationship with the stone, right? And some stones are going to say, yeah, we'll pull you favors just like you would with friends. Other ones, maybe not so much. And it is a warming up process on that one in particular, where if you have a big request, you might not get from a stone right away, right? So this is where I would look at this like notes possibly, or even ingredients in cooking, where you say, all right, I could sub this in, but I know so-and-so isn't going to mix well with so-and-so, right? So that's a really important piece. Now, what's interesting about another piece you said was elixirs, crystal elixirs. And in the book particularly, when most people think elixirs, they're thinking, oh, you put the stone in water. However, you did say you could put it in a vial of a separate glass and have the water around it so there's no contamination. So can you go into that a bit more?
Sure. So I think it's really important to stress safety in all things. And the truth is that there are a lot of unsafe minerals to put in your water or directly on your person. So we've got to know a little bit about the chemistry and the overall structure of things, because it's real easy to make a mistake and poison yourself or someone else for that matter. So when in doubt, leave it out. Always err on the side of caution and use indirect methods for creating crystal elixirs. If you really know the chemistry, you can go for it. There are a few safety guidelines in there, but also the big Crystal Basics has an entire page devoted to understanding what the physical and chemical parameters are for safety. And just know that there are also exceptions to the rule. There's only so much space you can fit in the written word. So when in doubt, always use an indirect method. My favorite method is the 2-container method, where you put crystals in a smaller container and you put that container inside your bowl or glass of water. So that way the water is safely protected from physically touching the stones, but their energy fields, their spiritual blueprint, their consciousness, their spirit is still animating and organizing all the little bits in that water so they can imprint upon it to produce the elixir in the end.
Right. So being separated from the water piece, is there a formal ritual that happens with this? Is there a formal meditation that happens with this? Or is it more just you drop the rock in a container, it's in a glass of water, you walk away?
There are different approaches. So there are those that are, we'll say, a little bit more mechanically oriented, and it's about getting the pieces together and letting them do their job. If we look at the kind of electromagnetic model of how and why crystals work, then we can rely just on this mechanical process. It will do its job given enough time. If you have a more consciousness-driven practice, then you can appeal to the consciousness of the stone. You could create it in a ritual setting. When I make a lot of essences in my own practice. I like to do it inside sacred space, whether that's casting a circle or creating some other kind of, we'll say, spiritual container for that work. You can do that. I especially do this when I work with flower essences out in the natural world. And then you can draw down or invoke or somehow, we'll say, access or activate that consciousness, that energy from the stone to imprint in a very permanent way onto the water. But I keep things pretty simple in the book because it is basics. We really are just reaching the foundational level. There's so much more we can do with that. And it's really a matter of sitting down and figuring out what those practices are for us, how they work best in our own framework that we've got.
Right. And in the framework side of things, was there something that was like, while in the process of writing the book, was there an interesting or an unexpected piece of knowledge that came in the research process that you're like, oh, I did not know this, and then you just dove into it a bit more?
Not really for this book. It was pretty straightforward because the work was a little formulaic. I will say that writing a pocket encyclopedia was not like my life's goal. It was not the one thing I dreamed of doing. It was the next rational step, the next thing I wanted to accomplish to better serve the Crystal community. Because of the condensed or consolidated format, there wasn't really space to do a lot of that work. I would say that the topic I included that is the most meaningful to me, that is different to my other books, is the discussion about ethics in collecting crystals and the extraction of mineral resources. Of course, in a pocket encyclopedia, we can't really give enough space to that topic to be as meaningful as I would like. But really reflecting on that over the last few years has been important. And so I included it in here out of that importance. So it was, it's a case of chicken or the egg. In this case, the topic came first. And the research followed rather than the other way around.
Gotcha. And can you just get a little bit more into the discussion of things? Because, I mean, I think people generally, if they work with crystals, they kind of know how they're extracted. However, you do talk a little bit about it, and you seem like you like to talk about more. So could you get into like just a little bit of the ethical pieces, like what does that mean in terms of going to a store or getting your own rocks, because these crystals are getting, like, essentially they have to get pulled from the earth, right? That is the extraction process, generally speaking, of them. So that does have some actual concerns.
Yeah, so there are a lot of ripples, there are a lot of moving pieces, and it's sometimes hard to navigate when we start to think about how every choice we make is dependent upon all these other actions taking place in the world. When you go to a store and you pick up a piece of tumbled amethyst, there's a really good chance, you find a nice piece of chevron amethyst in your local metaphysical store or witchy shop. That stone might have been sourced from someplace like Brazil or South Africa, and it was dug out of the earth through a variety of ways. It could be hydraulic equipment, it could be explosives, it could be artisanal hand labor, it could be sledgehammers, it could be, just fingers. And then it's going to be collected in mass and sent off to some other part of the world to be cut and polished or tumbled and have lapidary work on it. Then it'll be brought to some other part of the world where it'll be sold at an enormous trade show like you find in Tucson, Arizona, Denver, Colorado, Saint-Rémy in France. So many of these large events that take place throughout the world. And then from there, it'll trickle down into smaller and smaller events on the wholesale side until it reaches retailers. So it's possible that one tumbled stone, which you think of as coming from someplace like South Africa, it didn't just hop on a plane and take a straight journey to you, but has maybe circled the globe several times. And for every part of that journey, there is a carbon and energy footprint. For every part of that journey, there is a human and social footprint. For every part of that journey, there's an ecological footprint. It's not just what part of the earth was disrupted to pull the rock out of the ground. What were the conditions of mining like? What were the conditions involved in the lapidary side of things? Did people have protective gear to prevent them from inhaling particles of dust? Where did the byproducts, the runoff, the stuff get disposed of? How well were people paid? All of these things are part of the ethical ramifications of just going out and buying an inexpensive tumbled stone. And the truth is that for the majority of the material that we're going to encounter on the market, we're not going to know its story. The retailer is not going to know the whole story. Their source is not going to know the whole story. So it's the job of consumers to start asking these questions and expressing interest, because that's going to encourage retailers to do their due diligence, and they're going to ask their sources who ask their sources. The only way to really ensure a completely ethical crystal is to know its whole journey and to eliminate those that have kind of suspicious parts of that story, or unfair or unethical parts of that story. And, it comes down to it that, it's not just about crystals. When we think about the ethics of mining and extraction, I encourage everyone who's watching or listening to look at the space around them. Everything around you that wasn't grown from plant or animal resources is extracted from geological resources. That's paint, that's carpet fibers, that's building materials like concrete and brick and plasterboard. Like, everything around us is peppered with things that are of geologic origin. The devices that we're watching or listening to this on are full of important, rare, costly, expensive conflict minerals in some cases. So the ethical impact of this is not limited to what we do in crystal healing, but I think that the crystal world is often scapegoated. The real thing that we have to look at is big systemic change in how we treat people in the mining process, and also how we treat the earth in the mining process, the refining process, the distribution process. And it's very easy to lay blame on that rose quartz that we're going to find in our witchy shop. But the truth is that the fossil fuel industry, the technology and infrastructure industries, they have bigger ethical implications than any crystal or healing gem is going to have, which doesn't absolve us. It just reminds us that it's one part of a bigger picture that hopefully we work toward changing.
Well, right. And this is really coming down to, awareness of things, right? Like being aware of, and the gratitude aspects of, like, all right, you might be purchasing something to support your local store, or because that rock or crystal really calls out to you. However, it also is saying, even if you don't understand the full journey of things, at least being grateful that it even got in your hands. And this is where a cleansing process actually does happen, because, as you mentioned, it has switched multiple places and multiple times. And we don't know how many times that is. So this is where you do talk about a few different ways of cleansing. And it really depends on, the structures of the stone, what type of stone it is. As we know, some are water soluble, some aren't, etc. But the general piece is, what would a cleansing technique look like that applies to, I would say, the majority of stones? Not all of them, obviously, but the majority.
So my 3 favorite methods for cleansing are safe for virtually all crystals. Of course, we can use sunlight, moonlight, salt, dried botanic material, smoke, sound. The list goes on and on and on. But the 3 that are safe for pretty much anything you're going to have in your collection are sound, smoke, and breath. So I describe all of those in the book because they're pretty darn easy. Smoke is burning sacred herbs, resins, other botanicals that you like. I like to use things that I can find in my region, or things that I can purchase without any big ethical ramifications. When it comes to sound, live organic sound is usually better than pre-recorded sound, but we use what we can depending on what's available. That could be a fancy Tibetan singing bowl. It could be your palms clapping together. It could be the human voice. It could be a French horn or a grand piano. Just doing so with intention is what matters. And then breath is my absolute favorite method. And this technique was pioneered by a gentleman by the name of Marcel Vogel, who was a research scientist with IBM, the computer company, for 27 years. And he retired and went on to pursue energy medicine, crystal healing, psychic phenomena, and a handful of other things until his death in the 90s. And his breath technique is kind of the forerunner of the version that I use. I use a very slightly modified, simplified version in this and most of my other books, but I love it because you always have your breath. There are places where you won't have a singing bowl and you can't burn, Palo Santo or cedar or frankincense, but you've always got your breath. And if something is too delicate to breathe upon, and sure, those minerals exist, they're fragile, but they're also not the ones we're using in our practice. They're not the ones going in our pocket or, being used to make magic. They're sitting carefully behind glass or on a shelf out of reach to gently support us in the background. So I think breath is by far the most universal method to teach people.
Right. So, I mean, there you go. Some easy cleansing techniques everyone can use and not have to worry about their stones per se. So that's great. And more on a fun topic. You talked about the positive aspects being one of your favorite stones. What was one of the stones that you worked with that was more of, I would deem, a harder experience? Maybe not a negative experience, but at least a harder experience that it took a little time to accommodate to, and why?
I really love that you asked this because, we often in the world of energy medicine and crystal healing, we tend to focus on the things that make us feel good. And there's a kind of general phobia, we'll say, in the metaphysical world of things that feel out of sorts or things that feel disruptive. And we might be inclined to label them as harmful or bad. And I don't think that's true. I think what tends to happen is the crystals that feel the most warm and fuzzy are those that are reinforcing something that we already have within us. And those that feel a little disruptive, the ones that make us feel like we're off balance, are trying to entrain something new in our energy field. So they often have the biggest medicine available to us on that spiritual level. And for me, one of those gemstones was jade. When I wrote my very first book, The 7 Archetypal Stones, I started writing it in early 2014. I was working a corporate job, and the whole thing started on my commute to work. I had a piece of obsidian in my pocket, an idea popped into my head, and I just kind of pursued it. And chapter 2 is all about jade. And intellectually, I like the history of jade. I like its cultural value and symbolism. I appreciate the artifacts that I've seen from afar as well as up close, but I'd never really settled in to do the deep work. So I started. Turns out, jade's a really hard teacher. The end result of working with jade is one of refinement, grace, maybe even agility. There's a smoothness to it. But when we think about its raw material and the geologic journey that it's taken, it's been bent and squeezed and squished and broken and put back together, and it can do that for us. So one of the things that culturally jade is associated with are funerary practices, rites of death and rebirth, which can be a kind of symbolic shamanic death and rebirth, but it's also in many cultures a very literal sense of death, and it's included in grave goods. And jade breaks down things that aren't serving us well. It's really, really adept at the kind of ego death that we see in, especially Eastern practices. And if we're living too much from our ego, rather than using it as a helpful tool, but letting it use us, when that role gets reversed, jade packs a punch. And I was in a transitional phase myself when things were going really, really well in my corporate gig. I was living through a kind of corporate takeover by another corporation. And all of a sudden, things got real hard. And a lot of my personal identity was tapped into that career. So when I had to let go of that, it was scary. And jade gave me that push and helped me realize that it was part of the process of polishing the rough into that refined state. It took years. Here we are, and I'm pretty glad that I did that. And I'm glad jade was one of the several stones that supported that.
Right. And I want to be clear here. You're referencing jadeite, not nephrite jade, correct?
So historically, depending on where you are in the world, those were not necessarily separated. Nephrite jade is the one that was first written about, especially if we go to Chinese writings. Nephrite, the quote-unquote less precious of the two, which is made of amphibole series minerals, is the one that we see in classical Chinese literature and traditional Chinese medicine. And it really wouldn't be until about the 18th century that jadeite was known on a widespread level in China, when the Emperor Qianlong was made aware of its presence in nearby Myanmar, Burma, and literally waged war to get the quote-unquote imperial jade that we think of today, which is jadeite. But the term jade comes into English actually from the Spanish colonizers or conquistadors who went into South America and Central America and discovered this jade that they called piedra de la hijada, which means stone of the flank. The indigenous folks would use it for pain of the kidneys, the flanks of the body, and so that came into English from Spanish to French, pierre de jade, or stone of the flank, still to just le jade, the jade. Jadeite derives its name from that, but interestingly, nephrite comes from Latinized Greek lapis nephriticus, meaning kidney stone, implying the same part. So culturally, the two have been used interchangeably, and it's only relatively recently in geological history, in the history of geology as a science rather, that we've differentiated the two as being distinct rocks.
Right. Because I know, at least from practice standards, they do have slightly different personalities, at least in my experience on that. But yeah, for extensive purposes, I mean, yeah, jade, nephrite jade versus jade. Yeah. I always find that to be a fun conversation with people, especially since we do a lot here because we got the wellness center and we do have both sides of the jade. So, but yeah, that sounds like an incredible type of transition that Jade was pushing you through on the refinery too. And again, any particular color of jade you're working with on that one, or not so much?
I tried to sample from the buffet of jades for that book, so I got a pretty good experience of it. The jade, I haven't really touched jade much in recent years for my own personal work. And just this last week, I came back to it, and I have a kind of blue-gray piece from a river in Japan, and that one is actually jadeite. That I just picked up after a long hiatus from it. But I think people currently tend to associate green with jade, but different periods in history favored different colors. One of the most precious ones that we see in classical China is what we would translate as like mutton fat jade. It's a creamy, almost greasy, yellowy white, and that was the pinnacle of all jades at that point. So I'd say pick the variety that appeals to you.
Right. So, is there anything you have coming up? Last words for our listeners that you'd like them to hear?
Yeah, thank you so much. I run a lot of events here, there, and everywhere. So if anyone's interested in finding out where I'm going to be, events I'm going to be running in person or online, you can follow me on social media at The Luminous Pearl. Visit my website at theluminouspearl.com and sign up for my newsletter, which I send out once a month. My next one's going out Monday. And I look forward to traveling and bringing my rocks on the road to
All right. You got cut off there a little bit. So if you want to just repeat that last part, it was on the road and then it just went blank.
So I look forward to taking my rocks on the road, hopefully to a city near you.
There you go. So you check out his website that he listed there. It'll be in our descriptions when this goes up. We currently have his book, Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia, in our library. So if you want to take a read, you can take a read. However, remember that if you keep it too long, we're going to tell you to buy it from him. So do remember that. So again, tomorrow we have our Zachiel ritual for prosperity and expansion on the Jupiterian energies, and Andrieh will be running that with our hardcore rituals that we always do here. And then next week, the week afterward, we do have our how to communicate with a goddess. You pick the goddess. If you choose someone that's awesome, great. If you choose someone that's a little more destructive, we don't really care. But we do say, if you blow yourself up, it's better than nothing, but still, err with some caution depending who you choose. I mean, you pick anyone you want. However, we'd rather see you awesome on that, but everyone will have the tools regardless of whatever goddess you choose, whether it be a more loving, kind goddess to more of a spunky goddess to more of those destructive or at least transformative goddesses that have a little more of a stern mother kick. So it doesn't matter who you pick. It's all good. And then after that, what the weeks following, we are going to be setting up for our Goetic 3-year course summonings. Our friend and previous co-host Stephanie Colony will be working with us on that, and essentially that will be on Saturdays because nothing says demonic work like a Saturday or the Saturn's Day. So that will be in the evening, and then we'll have our normal things on the Sunday as usual. So next week we will have Conjure Necrodemon, Demonic Sorcery with Edgar Kervel. And then we'll have a few other shows that are following. It seems to be everyone kind of lined up on themes. It just ended up that way. So it goes with that. We'll have Terran S with Conjuring Dirt afterward. And then we get into a little bit of a chakra theme after that. So it just ended up the way it did for our upcoming shows. So with that said, everyone, remember, Nicholas's book is in our library, Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia, 450 gemstones. And with that, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.